So we can start to see the contours of this cultural framework of Christian nationalism when we start to talk about those things that are held in high regard.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in Massachusetts.
It isn't just about the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, but now all these other things that you need to do and accept and believe if you're going to represent, again, quote unquote, true Christianity.
Dr. Andrew L. Whitehead is Associate Professor of Sociology at Indiana University-Purdue University, Indianapolis, where he co-directs the Association of Religion Data Archives at the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. He is the co-author of the award-winning book, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, and has written for the Washington Post, NBC News, Time, and Religion News Service. Andrew's latest book is coming out this month, and he's back with us today on State of Belief to talk about it. The title is American Idolatry, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. I really hope you're getting as much out of hearing this show as we get out of putting it together week after week. To get these important conversations in front of more people who need to hear them, we've partnered with Religion News Service, the leading religion journalism organization in the country. And as part of the RNS family of podcasts, there's a next generation podcast I want to make sure you are subscribed to. Please visit stateofbelief.com/new podcast. State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how you can help keep this show on the air is available at stateofbelief.com. And you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join in that work at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my guest. Dr. Andrew Whitehead was with us a few months ago and brought deep insights on what makes Christian nationalism seemingly irresistible to some Americans, as well as the grave risk it poses to our pluralistic society and to democracy itself. Now, with his much-anticipated new book, about to be released on August 15th, he's back with us to discuss the threat this movement poses to American Christianity, and the title of his new book is American Idolatry, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. Andrew, welcome back to State of Belief.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great to be back with you.
I found this book irresistible, as we said, because it's really speaking into, not in abstract, but speaking into Christianity. And almost your audience are Christians who are wrestling with, how do I remain a Christian, how to become a Christian, how I live out my Christian faith, and how do I become and be a good American, and at the same time feel like empowered and aware enough to reject Christian nationalism.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad to hear that you had that experience in reading it, because that really was the goal. After over a decade of kind of my professional journey, studying Christian nationalism, defining it, doing surveys, and writing that first book, really coming to realize the threat that it poses not only to multiple aspects of American society, democracy, those types of things, but also to various expressions of the Christian faith, right? So if we're called by Jesus to love our neighbors and break down dividing walls of hostility and to welcome the refugee and the immigrant and all these different things, what I was finding over and over is that embracing Christian nationalism, I think, in many ways either stands in the way or actively works against Christians being able to follow Jesus and his commands. And so this book was really the goal of writing to fellow Christians and not saying that here is, this one sole expression you have to adopt, but that there are multiple expressions of the Christian faith that allow you to confront and oppose Christian nationalism, which is really focused on privileging one particular expression. And so throughout the book, try to draw that in.
Kind of the pivotal line is, I'm convinced that Christian nationalism makes us bad Christians. That kind of sums it up for you. And in part, this feels really important to you because you come out of the Christian tradition, and actually you come out of the Christian tradition that many of whom adhere or are seemingly buying into this expression of Christian faith. So this is not an abstraction to you. This is something that feels close to you. And we had Brad Onishi. I'm sure you know his work and probably know him personally. For him, like for you, it felt like he's kind of like, but for the grace of God go I, he could see himself. He was saying, I could see myself in January 6th. I could see myself being persuaded to be there. And I can imagine for you, like, this isn't like something that's so far removed. You probably still have many acquaintances and maybe even family members who have this kind of belief. So it feels very personal. And this book reads as personal as well as, grounded in the discipline that you're part of, which is sociology and other things, but it's also a personal book.
Yeah, definitely. That was the goal too, was, being able to bring together my personal journey of growing up, and then later wrestling with what I found to be Christian nationalism in my own faith and trying to disentangle what I was taught, right, of how we love Jesus and what Jesus commanded us to do. I was taught those things within congregations and within these social networks that embrace Christian nationalism too. But then as I got older or just further on my journey, started to see, well, we're told to love Jesus, but then, we're told to vote a particular way or support a particular policy that I felt like, well, this doesn't seem like we're loving our neighbors. And so trying to disentangle those. And so, with my personal journey, and I grew up in a large, white evangelical mega church. It's where I learned to love the Bible, love Jesus. It was a warm and inviting place through middle school and high school. I had trouble at home. And so this was a place that I felt accepted. And so there were good things about it, but then too, just in that journey, coming to terms with how I, later found out or have come to believe that there are aspects of this idea of privileging Christianity in the public sphere over and above, other expressions of Christianity or other religious traditions or secular Americans that I found, well, this moves us against what Jesus commanded. And so, that was real. And to be honest too, as you said, still have family members and friends, in those traditions, and even question, whether I'm still a Christian because I speak out against Christian nationalism. And to me, that really highlights what I'm trying to do in the book is to show when these are so intertwined, it really becomes a problem because if we're serving empire or America, right, there are going to be times where to be a faithful Christian means you have to be able to critique or move against what your country, no matter what it is asking you to do. And so, exploring some of that has, I've been on that journey for a while. And so that's reflected in this book as well.
Yeah. It's interesting for me, I came out of like the liberal Protestant tradition, like that was my tradition. And so I come at this slightly differently. The liberal Protestant tradition has its own foibles that it has to deal with, but it's not the same as coming out of the white evangelical tradition. There were I grew up with a woman pastor and thought that's just what Christians did. And, I never heard anything against gay people from the pulpit. And it was, very sort of like, how do we do this thing? And certainly the Black church and other expressions were always asking these questions that you ask in the book. We all come from at a different place. But one of the things that you just mentioned, which I think is so important, is that this is not just privileging Christians. It's privileging a very particular expression of Christianity. And as part of that, they're even most vehement to say that tradition does not represent the true Christianity. And now they're telling you that now that you've, gone on this journey, you left true Christianity behind. And that's also reflected in when you have these questions about America and what America has done in the past, what we need to do to go into the future. You're like, well, that means you're not a true American. This idea of what is true, what is it's very, very, and then, couple that with spiritual warfare and all this kind of stuff that makes it a zero-sum game of very difficult. I think it's really important that we we name some things about Christian nationalism for those people who really don't necessarily understand what the identifiers was. And one of my favorite parts of the book was your field guide to Christian nationalism, which
Right,
like
yeah.
I grew up in a family of birders. And I kind
There
of
you
felt like,
go.
there,
Yeah.
let's look at our book and like figure it out. So, I mean, not to objectify people or anything like that, but I like the idea of field guide to Christian nationalism. This is all. I'm going to mention your book title again so that people know what this is in and they can find it for themselves. It's American Idolatry: How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. So why don't you lead us into a little bit of the field guide to Christian nationalism and what those identifiers really signify?
Yeah, definitely. So, part of it with Christian nationalism, we identify empirically what it is, define it, and I provide that in the book. And again, like you said, highlighting this very particular expression of Christianity. And what that means really, when we get down to it, is that it isn't just about these historical or theological or orthodox Christian beliefs like Jesus was divine and, died on the cross and rose again. And those types of things are a part of it, but it isn't just that, right? What comes with it are all these other cultural beliefs and values that get added onto it. And it's this extra baggage that then we carry around. And so that is what we're really talking about with this a particular expression of Christianity. And so we can start to see the contours of this cultural framework of Christian nationalism when we start to talk about those things that are held in high regard that really go above and beyond those, it isn't just about the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, but now all these other things that you need to do and accept and believe if you're going to represent, again, quote unquote, true Christianity. So, a couple that always stand out to me are, and this was the first one in the book, when we have an American flag at the front of the congregation, right? So I grew up in congregations where there's the American flag and the Christian flag right there. And in 2006, the National Congregation Study asked a nationally representative sample of congregations, do you have a flag in your main worship space? And 60% of U.S. congregations at that time said, yes, they do. So this is not just, one or two, this is thousands of congregations do this. But I've had a pastor friend remark that if he ever wanted to anger half his congregation, he should either move or remove the U.S. flag from the front of the congregation. He said, then you're going to find out really quick, right, what this means to people. And so then that, I think, shows us when people feel that certain, symbols that are important to them are attacked. And in the book, I call these idols, right? When they feel those are attacked, you can see them really start to react. And so then if it angers people that much, my next question is, well, then what does it mean to them, right? It means something very deep. And so we have to really start to unpack that, because if you're a Christian from Australia or Ghana or any other country, and you come to the US and you see a flag there, it's going to be jarring, because what is it doing in this space, right? If we're all Christians, but now this flag is given, this kind of place of honor, what does that mean to them? And so I think as American Christians, when we start to think through that and from the perspective of others, so the American flag at the front, or Celebrate America services every 4th of July, right? Not that there is, not that the U.S. is, just all evil and bad. But on the flip side, it's not just all good, right? And when we celebrate militarism and warfare and say that God's always been on our side, that should give us pause as Christians. So those are others. But then I think the field guide really starts to lead into what I, throughout the book, then highlight and work out with these three idols of Christian nationalism. So power, fear, and violence. And when we start to think through the messages that we receive from others in our networks or from pastors, or in what we're supposed to, support policy-wise, all of those things, I think then we start to see that field guide. It kind of helps bring those into sharper relief of, okay, this should give us pause. What is Jesus telling us to do? What is our tradition showing us versus what we're being told to do, kind of to align with Christian nationalism?
One of the nice ways that you outline the book is using Jesus's sayings in juxtaposition with those three idols that you highlight, like turn the other cheek and the quest for power, and be not afraid, and yet doubling down on fear, and lay down your swords, and yet the turn towards violence. So it's cleverly done, but it also makes a really profound point that we need to ask these really important questions. And those three things really feel like the kind of unholy trinity of Christian nationalism. And I do think that that's where those of us who are working against it, whether or not within the Christian context or where I work, which is more with diverse faith traditions who are aware of it, but trying to understand it, and because they're not as close to it as you are, or even as I am, they're trying to what is it? And if you begin to talk about what's really going on here, it's not actually a Christian movement. In fact, it's wrapped in Christian movement, but it really is a power movement. That's where Catherine Stewart, I think, laid that out for me, that in a way that felt very that's a way that is helpful for me, especially as we avoid the pitfall, which they're very quickly to say, is that you're attacking Christianity.
Right.
That's like the main thing. And I'm like, no, we're not attacking Christianity here. We're actually, we're worried about is a political power grab using Christianity. Talk about those three idols and why they are such a threat broadly to our democracy. I just want to make clear, everybody should be able to believe what they want. I'm freedom of religion guy, if you want to believe something, that's fine. But what it makes you do is the other question. And these are all things that are making people do things that impact other people's lives in a way that feels quite frankly terrifying. And so let's talk first about quest for power.
Yeah, definitely. So, the quest for power, I think, really is kind of the central idol of Christian nationalism. It really comes down to this. And power is the ability to get others to do what you want despite resistance. And so we have to be really clear, because it isn't just that Christians should totally try to stay away from all power, that they shouldn't exercise it, that all power is evil, that type of thing. Because as we look to our even really recent past, the key is not just power, but self-interested power. Is it the execution of power that only benefits a particular group, the us, quote unquote, right? And so when we're talking about self-interested power, we can see really clearly how Christian nationalism really is focused on gaining, maintaining access to power that only benefits a particular group at the expense of other groups, outgroups, minorities.
And I should say, exactly right. And one of the things that differentiates it is that they are trying to use governmental power. It's not the question of what they do within their congregations. They're trying to gain the power of the government to represent those goals. Right. Which is different. That's very different. It's one thing to say, this is what we want to do in our congregation. It's another thing to want to take government and impose that on others. And I think that's an important, just complement of what you're saying.
Yeah. And not only that, but to limit who has access to the democratic process, right? Who has the ability to even weigh in on what we're going to do collectively. And so these groups that embrace Christian nationalism and this cultural framework have been for decades and are still saying, we need to limit who can vote and how easily they can vote. And so
that's one of the things that's great about your book, is that you have these frameworks, but then you also undergird it with your research and your polling and and so one of the identifiers actually of Christian nationalists is restricting access to the vote, and not saying that voter fraud is much more rampant than it is, and saying not every that we need to restrict the ways that people can vote. That's actually an identifying characteristic. I mean, so I just think that this kind of anti-democracy the instinct is really is also a through line. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just think that I do want people to, as we think about your book and as we're talking about this is American Idolatry, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. The great thing about this book is that it does have a great through line that I won't say it's like an altar call or a testimony, but it has that aspect to it. But it also is throughout it. It's just like it's grounded in hard fact because Andrew has been doing the research for a decade or more about this. And so he has the numbers, he has the receipts, as the kids say. So power is like a really important aspect of this. And a lot of this, and I think, what I try to, let people know is that a lot of this is grounded in fear. And you really get into that. Like it's this, which is a very powerful motivator. And, you hear government, you hear politicians and Donald Trump talks like this, like, I'm the only one who can save you. After me, le deluge. he's really like playing on that fear. And it's really connected with this Christian nationalist fear of losing power, but also like, oh no, they're coming for us. And it's like, that what a motivator, right? And so talk about this other this second idol of fear.
Yeah, definitely. So we have self-interested power and the desire to maintain and keep that privileged access to the right and the ability to say, this is the way things are going to be. But then fear is a primary tool of Christian nationalism to then motivate action, right? And especially to kind of create this vision of a national identity of who we are. But really it's focused on maintaining that privileged access to self-interested power, right? And so to do that, it has to draw these sharp lines between us versus them. And so fear is used to distinguish that. We can see that. So those who are committed to a quote unquote Christian nation, you need to know who we are and what we're about. And you need to know who they are and what they're coming for. And that is for you, right? For your privileged access to power or the way that you want to see the world. And so, social science and history show us over and over that stoking a sense of threat really makes in-groups pull together really tightly. And so again, this is key to developing and maintaining this framework of Christian nationalism. And so Christians are told over and over to essentially fear what might happen to them if they're a part of a true pluralistic democratic society, if they allow others to also weigh in on how the world should look and what should happen. And so we have a quip in sociology that equality feels like discrimination when you're accustomed to privilege. And so for Christians, any call to say, hey, we should share the ability to participate, they feel as though they're losing something when really they're losing privilege, right? The unquestioned kind of center of the culture that they imagine themselves as, to now become a seat at the table, right? You're no longer the head of the table and occupying almost every seat, but now you have a seat. And so you have to work differently then. You have to work with and compromise, and those are hard, but allowing Christians or hopefully providing American Christians expressions of Christianity that allow them to not fear loss of privilege, but now to see themselves as part of a community, right? An intertwined community with people different than them. And how can we move out and represent the gospel, right? As we could talk about, of seeking God's kingdom and the flourishing of all people here and now. How can we be a part of that work? And so when folks hear a message, I think one way to think about it is, what does this move me toward? Does it move me towards fear of the other or the world, or does it move me toward compassion to others? Right. And so I think there's where we can start to break down this idol of fear that Christian nationalism demands of us. Yeah,
it reminds me of Walter Raushenbush, my great-grandfather, who really says we need new tests for Christians. It's not enough to say you've had a conversion. But does your conversion make you more compassionate? Does it make you less judgmental? Does it make you want to change the system? For him, it was very economics of the system that leaves some in poverty and others extremely wealthy. Like, those are the new tests for Christianity. We'll take another break now and be back with more of this conversation with author Andrew Whitehead. If you miss any part of today's program, you can hear full episodes of State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. And make sure you're subscribed to the Next Generation podcast. Please go to stateofbelief.com/new podcast. That's stateofbelief.com/new podcast. You're listening to State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to State of Belief. I'm Paul Raushenbush. My guest is Christian nationalism expert Dr. Andrew Whitehead. His new book, coming out August 15th, is American Idolatry. One of the things you're doing is, again, repeatedly juxtapositioning how Jesus approached his time, which was, Jesus had no power, in the traditional sense of the power. And Jesus said, fear not. That a true faithful person would not be operate out of fear, but would operate out of love. And so I think that's really important. Violence is one of the ones that when I mention that to people I'm talking to, they all of a sudden are like, oh, right, yeah. Of course, we've seen it, we know it, but it's interesting that it's such an identifier of the willingness to be to use means that we feel that are undemocratic to get their goals. Talk a little bit about that and its juxtaposition with the way Jesus worked.
Yeah, definitely. So, as we look at self-interested power and this desire to maintain access to it, this fear of losing it, violence then is kind of used in service of defending those perceived threats to the group, the us versus the them. And it always revolves around protecting power. So when we idolize power and fear, violence is a natural response because, again, we're trying to take control of a situation to protect the quote unquote us. So when we succumb to that fear of losing something that we feel is ours, that will never recover, throughout history, we see over and over Christians and others. It isn't as though Christianity is the only, world religion that has had this problem, but many do. But Christians certainly aren't outside the trend here that they will use power and the threat of power to achieve those ends. And so, violence is a tough one because there's interpersonal level, individual level violence, and then there's collective violence that, no matter who we are as Americans, we're more or less implicated in those systems because we live here and, America goes to war or does things that, we may not as citizens prefer, but it's still happening, right? And so trying to make sense of those different levels of violence. But what I find and try to lay out in the book too is that Christian nationalism collapses those, right? That kind of systemic or at the cultural level versus individual, that it then just views all violence as essentially a right of any individual to maintain control within their situation, however they might see it. And so whether we're, in our suburban neighborhood or whether we're going to war, all those things we can start to see when we embrace Christian nationalism. We start to see it as God ordained and a right, because we're drawing on biblical narratives and we're using those, in a particular way to support the way that we see the world. And so then that becomes really dangerous. And so, when, one line in the book, when Jesus came, the only blood he shed was his own, right? He wasn't shedding the blood of anybody else. And so as Christians, and I think, I'm sure, Paul, you would agree with me here, is that many times, I think even for myself, I undersell the radical nature of Jesus' call, even today, right? What he calls us to, it's scary, right? It is radical and it is outside the norm. And I don't know that we really, I know I don't, and maybe it'll take my entire life and maybe not even then, but to really see how radical that call is of not just, being a doormat, but sacrificing in such a way that we resist the principalities and powers that push for violence. And so, even within that chapter, understanding it isn't just about like just war versus pacifism, but that even within the nonviolent tradition, there are many streams, right? And ways that Christians are thinking about how we live out a peace ethic. And so just inviting, hopefully readers in the American Christian church to take a beat, take a step back, right? From just saying like, hey, David and Goliath and Jericho, and like Christians are called to just, go and take control. But to really wrestle with, well, how do we live out faithfully in this context, and try to oppose those systems of violence and death that happen at the individual level, but also collectively that we're implicated in.
Yeah. I think this is one of the things that I think is really important to talk about, is the discipline that it takes to avoid violence and to avoid like the quest for power. And that's actually, I think, a role that congregations can play, is talking explicitly about that. And congregations can be a place where, that can resist, I think, Christian nationalism in a way that's really important to talk about. And one of the things I enjoy most is talking to congregations about, like, you can be a place where actual learning can happen in a moment where they're hollowing out libraries and hollowing out schools. You can be a place where real learning about your history and it can happen. You can be mobilized people. But one of the most important things that congregations can do is talk about what is the discipline that takes not to do this kind of stuff, and not to become what we hate as we work to undermine this. So, and part of that, one of the things I like to talk about is, I had a chance to interview John Lewis when he was alive, and, to talk about like the training that went into nonviolence resistance. They didn't just walk out there and it was like, oh, okay, well, I can do this. It's like, no, you actually have to go through this, and you can't show up to a protest without having done the spiritual discipline of understanding what you're doing when you're showing up in a nonviolent way, especially when you want to change systems and power. And so I think I think it's so important, and I want to get to this next, is like, what do we do? Because like this is happening. And I think one of the things like, this is happening. It's like, it's a real thing. It's, but it's also unpopular still. And we have to own that. Like, we have to say, this is not actually representative of the will of the people. It's the will of some people. Yeah. And so, like, not give them the luxury of the idea that this is what America needs to be, because it's not. So, that's one thing. But then how do, I love your book, but I'm worried, like, will it change anybody's mind? How do we actually, invite people to say, I see what you're doing. I see why you're doing it. There is another way. And I think I see that's what you're trying to do. I'm just wondering, have you seen success in this? Have you seen people kind of go, okay, this is not the direction I want to go in? Or, I would love to hear some, success stories, and then to be able to understand why they were successful. And what we can learn from that.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think, in the book too, try to provide some examples of folks who in their lives are taking steps to confront and oppose it, right? So whether it's getting involved in supporting groups or being a part of a group that defend religious freedom and religious liberty and the right to vote, right? That is something that is pushing against Christian nationalism, or a congregation that took up a collection and turned it over to a group of minority brothers and sisters in their community, and just allowed them to disperse those funds as a way of moving against this history of privilege that white Americans had, because Black Americans were not allowed to, in many ways, own homes at the same rate, or even get higher education, those types of things. Or another person who connected with refugees in her community and just helped them know where the grocery store is, help them know where the library is, help them with driver's manual training, right? And seeing, aligning ourselves with the marginalized and being able to see the world from their perspective and understand where that system is crushing them, and then doing what is needed in that moment to advocate for them. And I was born by historical accident in this country as a white man. and then grew up in a Christian area. And so this country has generally worked for me in every way. The only way that I could see how it doesn't is to listen to those stories of those who are not like me, and then to move hopefully alongside them. And so, I think those are some of the stories and success stories that we see happening even now. And one of the things that gives me hope is that there's unlimited creativity within congregations and people that, are hearing this call, are seeing that history, are seeing that social science, are understanding what this is about and what moves are being made against, others in this country at the benefit of the us. And so I'm excited to see too, that creativity be unleashed and how we can confront and oppose it. Because I know that I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I hope to give at least a viewpoint of what this is and expressions that move against it. And now let's continue to do that together. So I think in community, and as you said, in congregations, this is key. And I do see, especially for younger folks, as they read, our first book, Taking America Back for God, and hopefully they read this one. When I talk with college students, they see it very clearly. They know exactly what's going on. And if I had some of these, our books, but especially other books too, that have come out recently, if I had those 20 years ago, I think, wow, where would I be on my journey even today? So I think that gives us hope too. And those are some of the successes of the consistent pushback of various groups like Interfaith Alliance, Americans United, Baptist Joint Committee. These groups are providing Americans an entry point into not only understanding the difficulties we face, the threats we face, but then how to confront, pose, and move against those going forward. And so I think those are success stories as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And we certainly, this feels very urgent to us and a major focus. Okay, I'm gonna let's do a little role play. I'm a member of your family,
okay,
or a member of your former congregation, and I am in this. I am part of I'm on board with the Christian nationalism train, and I read your book, and I'm like, Andrew, what are you talking about? How do you talk to me in such a way that might, because I do think that's there's lots of ways to confront, movements like this. And many of them are really recognizing that we have to build power in such a way to use it to protect democracy and not just for our self-interest. But there's another way that's person to person. And people do change and people do grow. What would be a way that you would want to have a conversation with someone who is really immersed in this culture?
Yeah, I think the big thing for me is always talking about it in terms of the ideology itself and not trying to label anybody, right? In this book and our other work, don't try to label anybody a Christian nationalist, because I think at that point it becomes just a part of the identity. They feel personally attacked. But to talk about the framework itself and the ideas that surround it. And so a lot of times, I know on my own personal journey, the cracks, in the facade start to appear with questions that get asked. And so for me, questions that really started to influence me were, if America was founded as a Christian nation, which that narrative is central, obviously, to Christian nationalism. If it was founded as a Christian nation, then how could it have blessed this idea that we could enslave whole groups of people or commit genocide and not only kill, but push the people that were here before us off land that they had before us, right? So I don't see anything in Jesus' teaching that align with that. So how could a Christian nation do that? Or our founding fathers, if they were really intent on creating a Christian nation, why would it have been, formulated in such a way that women, minorities, basically anybody except white landowning men could fully participate in this country? Because that's where it started. So if we're talking about Christian values, that doesn't seem very Christ-like to me. So help me understand that, help explain that to me. And so I think using some of those questions and listening too, because even listening to some leaders within groups and organizations that are committed to Christian nationalism, there's times where I listen to, a full podcast of one of them. And while I don't agree with some of the presuppositions they have, or, policies they want to see come to the fore, it does help me empathize with some of those same things that I feel, which is, I hope for certain things, I want to see, people flourish. I think some of those folks make us way too small, and so I want to push back there. But even empathizing and listening to folks, I think, is key, because at the root, I think it is this fear of losing something's being taken away. And those are real fears. They're feeling real feelings, I should say. Now, are they based in reality? Generally not, right? So if they want to shut down all immigration because they feel like immigrants are taking jobs and increase crime, I get that they're feeling a real feeling. But when we look at the data, immigrants don't increase crime, and they don't take away jobs. And so if we can start to then have a conversation and think about, well, is this actually rooted in empirical evidence? In reality, we can hopefully then start to lower the temperature, and then to move forward that, hey, maybe those who are telling you to fear this group aren't really telling you the truth or serving you in a particular way. Or if Christ says this is how we should respond to those in need, how do these particular policies align with that? And so I think those are the ways that I do have conversations with family members or friends that I would encourage going forward. And then there are times where you may just have to not have that conversation for a while. You have to protect yourself too, where there are times where it's just not going to be fruitful. And I know pretty quickly in a conversation if this is not going to go anywhere. And so at that point, I just have to trust that I need to serve as a credible witness against maybe what they think is true, and allow them time to be on their journey. I would rather them move along on the journey, but I was on a journey and it took years, and it might take them years. And so I think those are things just to keep in mind that I try to think of too.
Curious how, this book comes out as we are really beginning to ramp up 2024 election, which is, I have to say, like, Christian nationalism does not seem like a sideshow to it. It feels very, very, really one of the themes of the 2024 presidential election that may not be always explicitly said, but it will, certainly many of the leading candidates on the Republican side are, seem to be speaking in ways that are, my field guide antennae go very like whoop whoop whoop. So I'm curious how you can imagine the 2024 election and Christian nationalism playing out in that sphere.
Yeah, it's a great question. And 2022 was really interesting and instructive as well, where the candidates who would lean on some of the Christian nationalism rhetoric, right? Kind of those age-old kind of a Christian nation, we need to get back to our values, and when things were working great in this country, all of those things that tended to work. For those candidates who just ran explicitly full steam ahead on Christian nationalism rhetoric, like Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania is one example, they didn't do as well. And so I think it really is kind of a seasoning rather than the main course when we're looking at politics, that people want it to be there and be around and kind of in the air. But I think for the moderates and independents, if it's too much, I think it tends to turn them off. And those are the folks that can turn elections. And we find in our research as well that independents and moderates who embrace Christian nationalism really strongly, Christian nationalism really works strongly for them, right? So it doesn't change much with Republicans because they're going to vote Republican if they self-identify. But if you identify as an independent or moderate, the degree to which you embrace Christian nationalism really tells me a lot about what you're going to do, right? It really pulls them into that Republican fold, and the same on the other side as well. And so I think as we look forward in the election, it's going to be there. It has been for decades. It's been a part of our body politic for so long that it isn't going anywhere. And I think to the extent that it is highlighted alongside these other policies that are part of the Republican Party, you're going to hear it and see it there. And that's what will pull in, moderates, independents, is kind of the judicious use of this rhetoric, this ideology, to kind of underscore that this is a battle of good and evil. And obviously we're on the side of good, and we want to bring America back to what God wants for it. All of those things, I think, really tend to work strongly as kind of political tools, right, in the toolkit.
Yeah, that's I like the seasoning rather than the main course. I think that's right. I hadn't quite put that together. One of the things that I definitely want you to be able to talk about that is very strong in your book is that there is a racial underpinning of Christian nationalism. It doesn't mean that all Christian nationalism, people who embrace Christian nationalism, are white, but there is a white supremacy worldview that accompanies it. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So one thing we find over and over empirically is when we ask this, collection of questions that we use to measure Christian nationalism, none of them mention race at all, right? They ask how strongly you agree if Christianity should be privileged in the U.S., or if the government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation, or if God has a special plan for the United States. So none of them mention race. But when we put those questions together and then we ask questions about race, like your level of comfort with interracial marriage or police violence towards Black Americans, what we find over and over is that how you answer the Christian nationalism questions is incredibly strongly associated with your views towards race, and generally in a direction where it's in a more racist direction, where you're going to be more likely to agree that police violence towards Black Americans is because Black Americans are inherently more violent, right? Or that you're more likely to be very uncomfortable with interracial marriage, these types of questions. And so what we find with that is that religion in the US, especially Christianity and Christian nationalism, has been fundamentally racialized from the beginning. And by that, we mean that it aligns with the structuring of society such that the benefits and privileges of society tend to flow to one group, and that has historically been white Americans. And so it's about whiteness, not necessarily white people, because you could have religious minorities or racial and ethnic minorities who embrace Christian nationalism, and so they would still, through embracing that, support this broader structuring of society that tends to benefit a particular group. And there's a number of different reasons, and I highlight this in the book as well, as to why it's important to call it white Christian nationalism. And really quickly, one of the reasons is why the narrative of racial difference, right, in this country happened alongside creation of theologies, right, that allowed Christians that came here to enslave, Black-skinned folk and to push off the land or commit violence toward brown-skinned folk because they were heathen and bad, whereas white and European and Christian was good. And so those categories happened very early on. And then the creation and maintenance of the narrative of the U.S. as a Christian nation primarily happened in and was maintained by white Christian institutions, whether it's mainline Protestantism, because they play a role historically for sure in that. So it's not as though they're off the hook, within white evangelical denominations and seminaries, white Catholicism as well. And so in those traditions, and white Christian traditions, that's where we see this narrative really taking hold. And so again, it isn't as though it's just white people holding Christian nationalism, but white Christian nationalism is focused on creating a hierarchy in society where the benefits flow to one group, and it tends to be white, natural born citizens.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just important to mention. We like to end the show with what gives you hope, because we often talk about weighty things on this show. And, but we also like to invite spiritual traditions and ethical traditions that do, offer hope to people. So what's giving you hope today?
Yeah. So, honestly, what's giving me hope, and this is a theme that I, rely on too in the book, where reading Kelly Brown Douglas's recent book, and where she's kind of writing to her son, and she's reflecting on how for decades and even centuries, Africans who were originally enslaved, or even through Jim Crow, they continued to push for a society that lived up to kind of the hope of America, where it was, all men, and they were literally meaning men at that point, but let's say all people are created equal, and this idea of flourishing, where these people were doing this hard work, and they never knew if they would personally benefit from it, but they still committed to it. And so for me, I've never obviously been in a situation like that. And there were times where I was feeling like, well, maybe, I'm sure you have days like this too. Like, is anything that I'm doing actually helping? Because you hope it is, but it can be a slog some days, because it just seems so constant. But then I was thinking about her book and about African Americans involved in the struggle for their own rights. And for those that lived and died under slavery, or even within Jim Crow, still maintaining faithfulness and pushing for a better future, and essentially planting those seeds that they may or may not see bloom, that was incredible to me. And so I kind of draw on them for hope and for an example of moving forward, that the structures and social systems that crush and oppress, they're always going to be with us. We see it through the story of Scripture in the Christian tradition. We see it throughout history. They're always going to be there. And yet, we can and should be daily doing what we can in our organizations or personally, to make room for flourishing, to push the line as far as we can, and knowing that we can't do it all, but that we can be a part of that broader work. I think that helps release me in ways, it helped me kind of release myself from any sort of ultimate responsibility for this, but that it just freed me to be creative and go and do, to hopefully make some sort of impact in making room for others that they might flourish as well. And so, yeah, that would be my hope for the work you do, for your organization, for others that want to see something look different than we've had in the past. And so, yeah, I think that's how I'd answer that question right now.
Dr. Andrew L. Whitehead is Associate Professor of Sociology at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, where he co-directs the Association of Religion Data Archives at the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. He is the co-author of the award-winning book, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. His latest book, American Idolatry, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church, is due out August 15th and is available for pre-order right now. Andrew, thank you so much for being with us today on State of Belief.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
And that's all the time we have for this week's State of Belief. Please be sure to subscribe to the new and improved podcast called The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/new podcast. Subscribe to The State of Belief today. We need your help keeping State of Belief on the air. I hope you'll consider being a partner in this crucial work by making a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And you can be part of making sure informative and encouraging voices like these are heard by sharing this program with friends and family. Let's get more people listening and more people taking part both on and off the air. And join the conversation. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at State of Belief, and share State of Belief with the people in your life. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I will be in conversation with Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, who leads New York City's congregation Bet Torah Simchat, the largest LGBT synagogue in the world, and is a former member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Raushenbush on State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.